Number 10. Homo luzonensis, the island human known, from only a few bones, on the island of Luzon in the northern Philippines, inside Calao Cave. Archaeologists found a discovery that looked small at first, but opened a much larger wound in the human story. There was no complete skeleton, no full skull, no dramatic body preserved in the ground. There were only fragments: teeth, finger bones, toe bones, and pieces of leg. But those fragments were strange enough to suggest that a forgotten kind of human had once lived on Luzon, separated from the mainland, surviving in a place where the accepted timeline of human evolution suddenly became harder to explain. That species was named Homo luzonensis, and almost immediately it became one of the most mysterious branches of the human family tree. And what makes Homo luzonensis so unsettling is how little evidence exists and how much those few bones imply. The remains date to tens of thousands of years ago, meaning this species lived surprisingly late in prehistory, when different kinds of humans were still scattered across parts of the world. But the anatomy does not fit neatly into one familiar category. Some features seem closer to modern humans. Others appear much older, as if the island had preserved traits from deep ancestry while reshaping the body in its own direction. The teeth are small but unusual. The finger and toe bones are especially strange, suggesting a mix of traits that does not match a simple evolutionary ladder. The island setting deepens the mystery. Luzon was not just a place ancient humans could easily walk to during low sea levels. The water separated it from the mainland, which means some earlier human population had to cross the sea, either by accident or with some form of simple watercraft. That possibility is disturbing because it suggests journeys we cannot reconstruct. Did their ancestors drift there after storms? Did they cross deliberately? Were they descended from Homo erectus, from another unknown Asian human group, or from a branch we have not found yet? Homo luzonensis does not only ask who they were, it asks how many human migrations happened before history had any way to remember them. Island evolution may have changed them further. Islands can shrink large animals, enlarge small ones, preserve old traits, and create strange forms found nowhere else. Homo floresiensis on Flores already showed that Southeast Asia could produce unexpected island humans. A Homo luzonensis suggests Luzon may have done the same in its own way. Ancient Asia may not have been home to a clean sequence of human species, but to a scattered patchwork of isolated human forms, each shaped by local pressure, each surviving in ecological corners, and each vulnerable to disappearance. The most unsettling possibility is that Homo luzonensis was not alone in being overlooked. If one island could preserve a human form known only from fragments, then other islands, caves, and submerged coastlines may have held their own lost human populations. Tropical climates destroy bone quickly. Rising seas hide ancient shorelines. Forests cover sites before anyone knows to search them. The absence of evidence may simply mean the evidence was erased. A Homo luzonensis may be less an exception than a warning that Southeast Asia once held more human diversity than the fossil record has allowed us to see. The ending of Homo luzonensis is completely unknown. They lived late enough that Homo sapiens may have been moving through Southeast Asia around the same broad period. Did our species ever meet them? Did modern humans see them as people, rivals, strangers, or prey? Did disease, climate, volcanic change, shrinking resources, or competition erase them before anyone could remember they existed? We do not know. There are no stories, no clear tools tied directly to their hands, no burials, no faces, and no final camp. A whole species appears to us only through scattered bones, and then disappears again into silence. That is why Homo luzonensis belongs among the ancient human species that disappeared without answers. It proves that the human family tree was not a straight line leading neatly to us. It was a broken forest full of side branches, island survivors, unknown migrations, and human forms that may have lived and died without ever touching the main story we inherited. Somewhere in prehistoric Luzon, these people moved through forests, climbed cave slopes, found food, raised children, and faced death as real beings in their own world. Then they vanished so completely that only a few bones remained to tell us they had ever existed. Number 9. Homo floresiensis, the Hobbit humans of Flores. On the Indonesian island of Flores, archaeologists uncovered a kind of human so small and so strange that at first it seemed almost impossible. Inside Liangbua cave, they found the remains of a tiny adult female with a body only a little over 1 meter tall and a brain far smaller than expected for a late surviving human relative. She was not a child. She was not simply a modern human with disease. The bones belonged to a population that had lived on the island for thousands of years, making tools, surviving volcanic landscapes, and sharing their world with animals that looked as if they came from a lost evolutionary experiment. The species was named Homo floresiensis, but the world quickly gave them another name, the Hobbit humans. What makes Homo floresiensis so unsettling is the timing. And these people may have survived until roughly 50,000 years ago, late enough to overlap with the spread of Homo sapiens through Southeast Asia. That means they were not remote ancestors buried safely in the deep beginning of humanity. They were recent neighbors in evolutionary time, living on an island while our own species was moving across the region. The idea that another kind of human existed so late, so close to the age of modern people, breaks the illusion that Homo sapiens quickly became alone. For a long time, the world was crowded with different human forms, and Flores was one of the places where that truth stayed hidden in cave sediment. Their bodies raise more questions than they answer. Homo floresiensis had a tiny stature, long feet, unusual limb proportions, and a skull that looked primitive in some ways despite the species living surprisingly late. But the small brain became the center of intense debate because it challenged the assumption that complex behavior always required a large brain. These island humans made stone tools, hunted or scavenged, and survived in a dangerous environment. If their brains were truly small, then intelligence in the human family may have taken forms we do not fully understand. A large brain was not the only way to endure. Flores itself may explain part of the mystery. Islands are laboratories of strange evolution. Large animals can shrink when resources are limited. Small animals can grow when predators are absent. On Flores, dwarf elephants called stegodon lived alongside giant rats, enormous birds, reptiles, and volcanic terrain. In such a place, an isolated human population could have changed dramatically over thousands of generations. And if Homo floresiensis descended from Homo erectus or an even older human ancestor, island dwarfism may have reshaped them into something unfamiliar. But the exact origin remains debated. Were they miniature descendants of a widespread human species, or survivors of a much older migration? The cave does not answer cleanly. Their world must have been brutal. A small-bodied human group on a volcanic island had to find food, avoid predators, manage fire or tools, and pass knowledge through generations. They lived near animals, larger, faster, and stronger than they were. They may have hunted young stegodon or scavenged carcasses. They may have used cooperative strategies to survive in an ecosystem where weakness could not be hidden. The name Hobbit makes them sound almost harmless, even charming, but that nickname softens the truth. These were real humans living under pressure in a dangerous island world, not fantasy creatures in a story. Then they disappeared. Their extinction may have been tied to climate change, volcanic eruptions, ecological shifts, or the arrival of Homo sapiens. That last possibility is the most uncomfortable. If modern humans reached Flores while Homo floresiensis still lived there, contact may have ended badly. It may not have required organized war. A small island population can collapse from competition, disease, resource loss, or even slight pressure from newcomers. A few generations of shrinking territory and fewer children can erase an entire species. The last Homo floresiensis may have died without knowing that no others remained. That is why Homo floresiensis belongs among the ancient human species that disappeared without answers. But they proved that the human family was stranger, more flexible, and more fragile than the old story allowed. tiny human species survived on an island, carried tools, adapted to a world of dwarf elephants and volcanic danger, and then vanished close enough to our time to feel unsettlingly near. We do not know what they sounded like, what they feared, what they taught their children, or whether they ever saw Homo sapiens approaching from the sea. We only know that they were here, that they were human, and that Flores kept their bones until the modern world was forced to admit that humanity once came in forms we never imagined. Number 8. Homo longi, the dragon man who may rewrite the human family tree. In northeastern China, a massive ancient skull surfaced from one of the strangest stories in paleoanthropology. It had reportedly been found decades earlier near Harbin, hidden away during a time of war and political turmoil, then kept from science for generations before finally being studied. When researchers examined it, the skull did not look like a simple variation of any familiar human. It was large, powerful, and hauntingly complete, with heavy brow ridges, a broad face, enormous eye sockets, and a brain case big enough to suggest a mind close in scale to ours. The skull became known as Dragon Man, and the species name proposed for it was Homo longi. What makes Homo longi so disturbing is not only the skull itself, but what it might mean. The human family tree is usually presented as if the major branches are clear. Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo erectus, and a few older relatives. But Dragon Man does not sit comfortably in that clean diagram. Some researchers argue that Homo longi may represent a separate human species from Middle Pleistocene Asia, possibly one of the closest known relatives of Homo sapiens. Others suspect the skull may be connected to the mysterious Denisovans, a human group known mostly from DNA and a few scattered fossils. If that link is correct, then Dragon Man may finally give a face to one of the most ghost-like humans ever discovered. That possibility is what makes the skull feel almost alive with unanswered questions. Denisovans left genetic traces in modern populations, especially in parts of Asia and Oceania, but their physical appearance remains unclear. But for years they were a human presence without a clear body, a shadow in the genome. Homo longi may belong to that shadow, or it may belong to another lost branch entirely. Either answer is unsettling. If Dragon Man was Denisovan, then a ghost species suddenly gains a face. If he was not, then Asia once held yet another large-brained human form living beside others, leaving behind almost nothing except one skull pulled from historical darkness. The anatomy itself tells a strange story. Homo longi had a mixture of features that feel both archaic and surprisingly close. The face was broad and strong, the brow heavy, the skull massive, but the brain size suggests advanced cognitive potential. This was not an animal-like ancestor barely separated from apes. This was a human relative with a large brain, a real body, and a place in the ancient world. And he lived in a cold northern landscape where survival required adaptation, memory, and skill. Fire, tools, shelter, clothing, cooperation, and social knowledge may all have mattered. But because the evidence is so limited, his culture remains almost invisible. That invisibility is the horror of Homo longi. A skull can tell us shape, age, anatomy, and possible relationships, but it cannot tell us what the person saw when he looked at others, what sounds his group used, how they treated their dead, whether they met Homo sapiens, or whether they knew other humankinds existed. The fossil record gives us the face and takes away the life. We can measure the bones, compare the brow, scan the teeth, and debate the branch, but we cannot recover the world behind the eyes. A whole population may once have lived across northern Asia, and yet science may have only one face to represent them, and their disappearance is just as unclear as their identity. If Homo longi represents a separate species, what happened to them? Were they absorbed into later populations? Did they disappear during climate shifts? Were they outcompeted by Homo sapiens, by other human groups, or by changing environments that made their northern world harder to survive? If they were Denisovan-related, then parts of them still live in some modern humans, but the people themselves vanished as a distinct form of humanity. If they were not Denisovran, then their extinction may have been even more complete, leaving no certain descendants and almost no trace. That is why Homo longi belongs among the ancient human species that disappeared without answers. Dragon Man is not just a skull, it is a challenge to the idea that we already understand the human family, and it suggests that Asia may have been a crowded, complicated landscape of human diversity, where large-brained relatives lived, adapted, met, mixed, and vanished in patterns we are only beginning to see. Somewhere in the cold, ancient north, people like Dragon Man may have walked through river valleys, watched fires burn, raised children, and faced winters beneath the same sky that later belonged to us. Then their world disappeared, leaving one heavy skull to ask whether the human story still has missing faces. Number 7. Homo antecessor, the face from Europe's lost dawn. In the hills of northern Spain, inside the ancient cave system of Atapuerca, archaeologists uncovered human remains that seemed to come from a Europe older and more violent than anyone expected. The bones were found in a site called Grandolina, buried in layers hundreds of thousands of years old. They did not belong to Neanderthals, and they were not modern humans. They belonged to something earlier, something standing near the beginning of Europe's human story, but refusing to fit neatly into it. The species was named Homo antecessor, a name meaning pioneer or explorer, as if these people were among the first human forms to push deep into the western edge of the continent. What makes Homo antecessor so unsettling is the face. Some features of the remains, especially from a young individual, appear surprisingly modern compared with their great age. The face seems flatter and more familiar than expected, almost like a glimpse of Homo sapiens appearing far too early in the European past. But other parts of the body and teeth belong to a much more archaic world. This mixture makes Homo antecessor difficult to place. Were they direct ancestors of later humans? Were they a side branch that vanished without descendants? Were they related to the population that eventually gave rise to Neanderthals, Denisovans, and modern humans? Or were they one more lost experiment in the crowded human family tree? The world they inhabited was harsh and unstable. Europe nearly 1 million years ago was not a continent of cities, farms, or familiar landscapes. It was a land of shifting climates, cold periods, open plains, forests, predators, and migrating animals. To survive there, early humans needed fire, cooperation, memory, and courage, or at least enough of those things to endure. Homo antecessor may have lived in small groups, moving through dangerous terrain, competing with carnivores, scavenging, hunting, and using caves as shelters. Their existence proves that Europe was occupied by humans far earlier than older models once comfortably allowed. But it does not tell us how many came, how long they lasted, or why their story ended. The most disturbing evidence from Grandolina is not only that these people lived there, it is what happened to some of them. Human bones from the site show cut marks, breakage, and signs of defleshing, similar to the processing of animal remains. And this suggests that members of Homo antecessor, or another human group living nearby, may have been butchered and eaten. The idea is difficult to soften. These were not distant animals. They were humans or close human relatives, processed with stone tools in the same world where survival was never secure. Whether this was nutritional cannibalism, violence between groups, ritual behavior, or some combination we cannot reconstruct, the cave preserves a brutal truth. The dawn of Europe's human story may already have included humans consuming humans. That makes Homo antecessor feel less like a fossil category and more like a warning. The first humans in Europe were not entering an empty promised land. They were entering a dangerous continent where small groups could disappear quickly, where hunger could turn social boundaries fragile, and where contact between human bands may not have been peaceful. The remains at Grandolina do not give us the final chapter of their species, but they show us a world where life and death were close, and where the body of another human could become part of survival. Their disappearance remains unanswered. Homo antecessor does not continue clearly into later history. After them, the European fossil record shifts toward other human forms, especially the ancestors and relatives of Neanderthals. Did Homo antecessor evolve into those later populations? Did they die out when climates changed? Were they replaced by other groups moving in from Africa or Western Asia? Did small isolated populations vanish one by one, leaving no direct line into the future? The evidence is too fragmentary to give a clean answer. They appear in the record, disturb the timeline, and then fade into the deeper confusion of the Middle Pleistocene. That is why Homo antecessor belongs among the ancient human species that disappeared without answers. They stand near the entrance to Europe's human past, with a face that looks strangely familiar and a story that remains violently incomplete. They may have been pioneers, ancestors, cousins, or a dead-end branch that left no living descendants. We do not know. Don't know. What we do know is that they lived, struggled, and died in a Europe where the human future was not yet decided. In the bones of Atapuerca, we find not a simple beginning, but a darker truth. The first chapters of humanity in Europe were written in caves, teeth, cut marks, and silence. Number 6. Homo heidelbergensis, the ancestor, who split into ghosts, long before Neanderthals ruled Ice Age Europe, long before Denisovans left hidden traces in Asian DNA, and long before Homo sapiens became the last human species standing, there was an older human form near the crossroads of all three. Homo heidelbergensis lived across parts of Africa and Eurasia hundreds of thousands of years ago, with a powerful body, a large brain, and a place in the human family tree that remains deeply contested. Some researchers see them as ancestors of Neanderthals. Others connect African populations to the roots of Homo sapiens. Others think the name may hide more than one species under one label. That uncertainty is what makes them haunting. Homo heidelbergensis may not be one vanished people, but the shadow of several. The first famous remains were found near Heidelberg in Germany, beginning with a strong lower jaw that looked too ancient to be modern and too advanced to be dismissed as simple. Since then, fossils from Europe, Africa, and possibly Asia have been placed in or near the heidelbergensis category, but the borders of that category are unstable. Some skulls are massive and archaic. Some lean toward Neanderthals. Others point more toward later humans. The species sits in the middle of the map like a fog bank, connecting branches while also blurring them. To study Homo heidelbergensis is to stand where the human family tree stops looking clean. Their world was one of large animals, shifting climates, and repeated survival tests. These people lived during a period when ice ages came and went, forests expanded and retreated, and human groups had to follow changing landscapes across continents. And they hunted dangerous prey, used stone tools, likely controlled fire, and occupied environments that demanded cooperation. The famous wooden spears from Schöningen, often linked to humans of this broad period, show that early humans could plan hunts with astonishing skill. These were not helpless scavengers. They were predators with strategy, memory, and weapons made long before metal, writing, or farming. What makes Homo heidelbergensis especially important is that they may represent the population from which later human worlds divided. In Europe, descendants may have become Neanderthals, the cold-adapted humans who survived for hundreds of thousands of years before vanishing. In Asia, related groups may have contributed to the Denisovan line, the ghost humans known mostly from DNA. In Africa, other related populations may have moved gradually toward Homo sapiens. If this picture is correct, then Homo heidelbergensis was not simply another extinct species. They were the broken root system beneath several later human branches, a population whose descendants became different kinds of humanity. But that same role makes them difficult to define. If the fossils called Homo heidelbergensis are too diverse, then maybe the name is a scientific convenience rather than a single true species. Maybe researchers gathered multiple related populations under one label because the fossil record is too broken to separate them cleanly. That possibility is disturbing because it means an important part of our ancestry may be hidden behind a name that does not fully describe reality. We may be looking at several lost human stories and calling them one, and their disappearance may not have been one extinction, but a transformation, a splitting and a fading of older populations. Their ending is almost impossible to see. They did not vanish like a city abandoned in a single century. They seem to dissolve into descendants, side branches, and regional forms. In some places, they may have evolved into Neanderthals. In others, they may have been replaced by later humans. In Africa, some descendants may have become part of the line that led to us. This is a strange kind of disappearance, not a clean death, but a loss of identity. The people were real, but the category slips through our hands. They became ghosts, not because they left no trace, but because their traces are everywhere and nowhere at once. That is why Homo heidelbergensis belongs among the ancient human species that disappeared without answers. And they stand at one of the most important crossroads in human evolution, yet even their identity remains uncertain. Were they our ancestor, our cousin, a cluster of related populations, or the name we give to a transition we do not fully understand? Somewhere in the deep Middle Pleistocene, powerful human groups hunted, made tools, raised children, used fire, and adapted across continents. Then their world split apart into other humanities, and the original form disappeared into the branches it created. Homo heidelbergensis did not leave us one mystery. It left us the possibility that the roots of our own species are still not clearly known. Number 5, Homo rudolfensis. The skull that refuses to fit in the dry landscapes of East Africa, near the ancient shores of Lake Turkana, a skull was found that refused to behave like a clean piece of the human story. It was broad-faced, large-brained for its age, and strange enough that researchers could not simply place it where the old evolutionary ladder expected it to go. The fossil became known as K-NM-01470 and later became central to the species called Homo rudolfensis. At first glance, it seemed to offer a clearer view of early Homo, one of the first human relatives moving beyond ape-like ancestors toward the genus that would eventually lead to us. But the more scientists studied it, the less clear the picture became. Instead of solving a mystery, the skull created one. A Homo rudolfensis lived more than 2 million years ago, in a world where the human family was still forming. East Africa at that time was not a simple birthplace of one inevitable lineage. It was a crowded evolutionary landscape filled with different hominins experimenting with body size, teeth, diet, tools, walking, and brain expansion. Some branches would vanish. Some would lead nowhere. Some may have overlapped so closely that their bones seem to argue with each other from the ground. Homo rudolfensis belongs to that confusion. It looks human enough to matter deeply, but different enough to resist easy classification. The skull has a large, flat face, big teeth, and a brain larger than many earlier hominins, yet it does not match neatly with Homo habilis, the famous early toolmaker, often placed near the beginning of our genus. For decades, researchers debated whether Homo rudolfensis was truly a separate species, a male or female variation of another species, a distorted fossil, or part of a wider population that included multiple forms. The arguments are not just technical, they strike at the question of how the human line began. Was early Homo one variable species slowly changing over time, or were there several different human-like species living side by side, competing in the same landscapes, each carrying a different possible future? That question is disturbing because it means our origin was not clean. We like to imagine a single path leading from primitive ancestors toward modern humans, but Homo rudolfensis suggests a messier beginning. And there may have been multiple kinds of early humans walking near the same lakes, feeding from the same environments, avoiding the same predators, and perhaps using similar tools. Some had smaller brains, some had larger faces, some had different jaws and teeth. They may not have known each other as different species, but their bodies were following different evolutionary strategies. The future of humanity was not yet decided. It was being tested in several forms at once. The environment around Lake Turkana would have been dangerous and unpredictable. Grasslands, wetlands, woodlands, volcanic landscapes, and shifting water sources created opportunities and threats. Large predators hunted there. Food sources changed with climate. Early Homo groups had to scavenge, gather, perhaps hunt small animals, crack bones, process plants, and remember where resources could be found. And if Homo rudolfensis had a larger brain, that did not make survival easy. A brain costs energy, it must be fed. It only matters if it helps a body survive long enough to reproduce. The skull hints at potential, but potential is not destiny. The disappearance of Homo rudolfensis is almost invisible. There is no final cave, no last campfire, no dramatic extinction layer. The fossils appear, raise arguments, and then fade into the deeper record of early Homo. Perhaps they were replaced by other species better adapted to changing environments. Perhaps they interbred with related populations. Perhaps the name itself will one day be revised, and the species will dissolve into another category. That possibility makes them even more ghost-like. Some vanished humans disappear because their populations died. Others disappear because science cannot decide what they were. But that is why Homo rudolfensis belongs among the ancient human species that disappeared without answers. It is not famous because of a complete body or a dramatic survival story. It is famous because one skull forced researchers to admit that the beginning of Homo was not a straight line. Somewhere in ancient East Africa, a broad-faced human relative lived, ate, moved, survived, and left behind bones that still refused to fit. Their world is gone, their identity is debated, and their place in our ancestry remains uncertain. Homo rudolfensis is a reminder that even the roots of humanity are not solid ground. They are fragments, arguments, and missing branches beneath our feet. Number 4. Homo habilis, the toolmaker, who may not be one. Species. For a long time, Homo habilis was presented as one of the first clear steps toward us. The name means handy man, and it carried a powerful idea. Here was an early human relative with enough brain, enough skill, and enough control of stone to begin the technological story of humanity. Found in East Africa, associated with some of the oldest stone tool traditions, Homo habilis seemed to stand near the doorway of our genus, between older ape-like ancestors and later humans who would spread across continents. It was the kind of fossil category textbooks loved because it made the story feel orderly. First came the toolmaker, then came the wanderer, then came the larger brain, then eventually us. But Homo habilis is far less clean than that story suggests. The fossils assigned to this name do not all fit comfortably together. Some skulls are smaller and more primitive. Some jaws and teeth seem different. Some bodies appear to retain long arms and climbing adaptations that feel closer to older hominins than to later members of Homo. The brain was larger than many earlier ancestors, but not always by enough to make the boundary obvious. The face, teeth, hands, and body proportions create a confusing mosaic. Instead of one neat species standing at the beginning of humanity, Homo habilis may be a label covering several different early human forms. That possibility makes the name disturbing. If Homo habilis is not one species, then one of the most familiar first humans in the story may actually be a bundle of unresolved fragments. Some researchers have argued that certain fossils placed under Homo habilis should be separated into other species, while others question whether some belong in Homo at all. This is not just a technical debate over bones. It changes the meaning of the beginning. The dawn of our genus may not have been one clear emergence, but a messy crowd of hominins experimenting with tools, diet, movement, and survival. Some looked more human, some looked less human. Some may have overlapped with Homo rudolfensis and early Homo erectus. The toolmaker image also becomes more complicated. Homo habilis was linked to Oldowan stone tools, simple but effective flakes and cores used to cut meat, break bones, and process plants. For decades, this connection made the species feel like the first true technological human. But stone tools may not belong to one species alone. Different hominins could have used similar tools. Some tool traditions may have begun before Homo habilis, meaning the ability to shape stone was not a clean dividing line between human and non-human. The hand that made the tool may not always have belonged to the species we named handy man. Still, the world of Homo habilis was real and dangerous. These early humans lived among predators, changing climates, open landscapes, woodlands, lakes, and volcanic regions where survival depended on flexibility. They were not powerful hunters in the later human sense. They were small-bodied beings trying to find food in ecosystems dominated by cats, hyenas, crocodiles, and larger animals. A sharp stone flake could change everything. It could open a carcass before another predator returned. It could cut hide, scrape meat, crack bone, and turn the leftovers of the landscape into calories. The technology did not make them masters of the world. It gave them a narrow advantage. Their disappearance is hard to describe because we are not even fully sure where one form ends and another begins. Homo habilis does not leave a clear final chapter. The fossils fade as later humans appear, especially Homo erectus, with a taller body, longer legs, and a clearer ability to travel across great distances. Did Homo habilis evolve into later humans? Did some populations survive beside Homo erectus for a time? Did they disappear through competition, climate pressure, or absorption into related groups? Or is the name itself hiding several endings under one label? The answer remains uncertain because the evidence is scattered, broken, and argued over bone by bone. That is why Homo habilis belongs among the ancient humans that disappeared without answers. It represents the uncomfortable truth that even the beginning of the human genus is not settled. The handy man may not be one man, one species, or one clean step toward us. It may be a shadow cast by several early humans whose bones were found in pieces and forced into a story that wanted order. Somewhere in ancient Africa, these beings walked, climbed, scavenged, cut, carried, and survived with stone in their hands. They helped open the age of tools, but their own identity remains unfinished. Homo habilis reminds us that the first chapter of humanity may not be a chapter at all, but a pile of fragments we are still trying to arrange into a name. Number 3. Homo erectus, the human who survived too long to explain. Few ancient humans were as successful, as widespread, or as difficult to explain as Homo erectus. If Homo habilis opened the age of tools, Homo erectus opened the age of movement. This was the human who left Africa, crossed into Asia, reached islands and forests, endured changing climates, and survived for an astonishing span of time. Some forms linked to Homo erectus appeared nearly 2 million years ago, and late populations may have persisted far closer to the modern age than once seemed possible. That means this was not a brief experiment in the human family tree. Homo erectus was one of its longest-running answers. Their bodies were different from the smaller, more ape-like forms that came before. The Homo erectus had longer legs, a more efficient walking and running body, and a shape that looks much closer to later humans. They could move across open landscapes, follow animals, carry tools, and survive over long distances in ways earlier hominins may not have managed as well. Their brain was larger than that of Homo habilis, though still smaller than ours. Their faces were heavy, their brows strong, their skulls long and low. They were human enough to feel familiar, yet ancient enough to remind us that the road to us was not made by us alone. What makes Homo erectus so unsettling is how far they went. Their remains, or fossils often placed close to them, have been found across Africa and Asia, from East African landscapes to Java, China, and beyond. To Tertum, they crossed ecological worlds that would have challenged any creature: grasslands, forests, volcanic regions, river systems, coastlines, and cold northern zones. They made stone tools, likely used fire in at least some places, and may have hunted, scavenged, gathered, and adapted with a flexibility that allowed them to outlast almost every other human species. For hundreds of thousands of years, the world may have belonged more to Homo erectus than to anyone like us. But their success creates the central mystery. How can a human species survive so long, spread so widely, and still disappear so quietly? Homo erectus did not leave behind writing, monuments, clear ritual burials, or the kind of symbolic objects that let us enter their minds. Their record is huge in time, but thin in voice. We can see where they walked, where they shaped stone, where they left bones, and where their fires may have burned. But we do not know what they communicated, whether they told stories, how they saw the dead, or what they understood about themselves. A species can dominate deep time and still remain almost silent. The final populations are even more haunting. On Java, fossils from Nandong have been interpreted by some researchers as representing very late Homo erectus, possibly surviving long after related populations elsewhere had vanished. If that is correct, then Homo erectus may have endured in island or river environments while newer human species moved through other parts of the world. Imagine that possibility. An ancient human form descended from the first great wanderers out of Africa, still living in pockets of Asia, while the age of Homo sapiens was approaching. They were not primitive failures at the beginning of the story. They may have been late survivors at its edge. Their extinction has no clear answer. Climate may have changed the river valleys and forests they depended on. Competition with later humans may have squeezed them out. Small, isolated groups may have become vulnerable to disease, environmental shifts, volcanic events, or simple bad luck. If Homo sapiens reached regions where the last Homo erectus lived, contact may have been brief, confusing, or fatal. But the fossil record does not give us a final encounter. It gives us a long survival and then absence. The most successful traveler of the early human world eventually left no living population behind. That is why Homo erectus belongs among the ancient human species that disappeared without answers. They were not a minor side branch. They were one of the great human experiments, walkers, toolmakers, survivors, and migrants who carried the human form across continents long before we became the last ones standing. Their long existence should make them easier to understand, but instead it makes their silence larger. For nearly 2 million years, they endured. Then the line ended or dissolved or was replaced, and no one remembered them until bone and stone brought them back. Homo erectus reminds us that survival across deep time is not the same as permanence. Even a human species that lasted longer than civilization itself can vanish without leaving a final word. Number 2. The Red Deer Cave people, the last unknown humans of China. In southern China, inside caves used by people near the end of the Ice Age, archaeologists found human bones that refused to settle into any comfortable category. The remains came from sites such as Maludong, often called Red Deer Cave, and they belonged to people who lived surprisingly late in prehistory, around the time when Homo sapiens had already spread widely across the world. At first, they might have seemed like another group of ancient modern humans, but the skulls, jaws, and teeth carried a strange mixture of traits. Some looked modern, others looked archaic, as if a human form from a much older world had survived in China far longer than expected. That is what makes the Red Deer Cave people so disturbing. They are not officially accepted as a separate species by everyone, and that uncertainty is part of the mystery. Some researchers see them as unusual Homo sapiens, perhaps a population with rare features shaped by isolation. Others have suggested they could represent a hybrid group, carrying ancestry from modern humans and another unknown archaic population. Another possibility is even stranger. They may preserve traces of a late surviving human lineage in East Asia, one that did not fit neatly into Neanderthals, Denisovans, or Homo erectus. The bones do not give a final answer. They only keep asking why they look so different. Their timing makes the question harder to ignore. These people lived only about 14,000 to 11,000 years ago, close to the edge of the world we usually consider fully modern. By then, the Great Ice Age was ending. The humans were hunting, gathering, experimenting with new ways of life, and moving through changing landscapes. If the Red Deer Cave people were simply unusual modern humans, then they show how much variation existed before later populations smoothed over the record. But if they were something else, or partly something else, then another kind of humanity may have survived almost into the dawn of the Holocene, far later than the clean story of human replacement allows. The name comes from evidence that these people processed and ate red deer, using the cave as a place of repeated activity. But behind that ordinary detail is a much darker silence. We do not know what they called themselves, what language they spoke, what they believed, or how they understood their own bodies and neighbors. But did they know other groups were different from them? Did they meet incoming populations of Homo sapiens who looked unlike them? Did they trade, fight, interbreed, or avoid one another? The cave gives bones and animal remains, but not voices. It shows life, but not identity. What makes the Red Deer Cave people especially haunting is that East Asia's human past is still full of shadows. Denisovan DNA proves that unknown human relatives lived somewhere across the region, yet their bones remain scarce. Homo erectus survived in Asia for an immense span of time. Other fossils from China have features that do not fit easily into old categories. The Red Deer Cave remains a peer inside that larger confusion, like a late echo from a human world that may have been far more crowded than we once imagined. But instead of one modern population replacing every other form, quickly and cleanly, there may have been pockets, mixtures, survivors, and local lineages fading at different times. Their disappearance has no dramatic final scene. There is no clear extinction layer, no known battle, no last village, no named catastrophe. If they were a distinct or partly distinct lineage, they seem to have vanished quietly into the expanding world of later humans. Perhaps they were absorbed by interbreeding. Perhaps small population size made them fragile. Perhaps climate change, disease, or competition reduced them until their features disappeared from the living population. Or perhaps the mystery is not extinction at all, but classification. They may be modern humans whose unusual anatomy reminds us that our species itself was once more diverse than we expect. That is why the Red Deer Cave people belong among the ancient human species and lineages that disappeared without answers. They stand at the border between species, population, and ghost, late enough to feel close, strange enough to disturb, and incomplete enough to resist a final label. Somewhere in southern China, near the end of the Ice Age, these people lived, hunted, butchered deer, used caves, raised children, and carried a body plan that still confuses the modern world. Then they faded into silence. What remains is not enough to name them with certainty, but enough to remind us that the last unknown humans may not have vanished in the deep past. Some may have survived almost to the doorstep of history, leaving behind bones that still refuse to tell us who they were. Number 1, the ghost populations, the humans known only from DNA. The strangest humans in prehistory may be the ones we have never seen. No complete skull, no named cave skeleton, no face reconstructed in a museum, no clear tool tradition that can be placed into their hands. Only fragments of DNA inside living people, pointing toward human groups that must have existed, must have met our ancestors, and must have left descendants, even though their bones remain missing. These are the ghost populations, vanished humans known not from fossils, but from genetic shadows. They are proof that the human family tree still contains branches without bodies. For a long time, scientists could only build human history from bones, tools, and archaeological sites. If a population left no skeleton, it was almost invisible. But genetics changed the rules. When researchers compared the genomes of modern humans with known ancient DNA, they found signals that did not fit neatly into Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, or Denisovans. Some modern populations carry traces suggesting contact with unknown archaic humans in Africa or Asia. These signals are not stories or legends. They are statistical scars, patterns of inheritance that point to vanished groups whose names, faces, and bodies have not been recovered. That is what makes ghost populations so unsettling. A fossil can be placed on a table, a tooth can be measured, a skull can be scanned. but a ghost population exists as an absence shaped like a person. We know something was there because it left marks in descendants, but we cannot say what it looked like, where it lived, how it moved, what tools it made, or when its last members died. It is like seeing footprints in wet ground leading into darkness, with no body at the end of the trail. The genome tells us that our ancestors were not alone, but the earth refuses to show us who stood beside them. Africa may hold some of the deepest ghost stories. Our species emerged there, but it did not emerge into an empty continent. For hundreds of thousands of years, different human populations may have lived in different regions, separated by deserts, forests, rivers, and climate shifts, then meeting again when the environment changed. Some of these groups may have been early Homo sapiens. Others may have been more archaic humans, distant relatives who survived alongside our direct ancestors. If they interbred, then pieces of those lost lineages could have entered modern humans without leaving a clear fossil identity behind. And in that sense, the origin of Homo sapiens may not have been a single birth, but a merging of several ancient human worlds. Asia carries its own shadows. Denisovans were once almost entirely ghost-like themselves, known mainly from DNA before more fragmentary fossils entered the picture. Their story suggests that other hidden humans could be waiting in the same way, first visible only through genetics, then perhaps one day through a jaw, a tooth, or a skull found in a cave. Some modern populations carry ancestry that seems to come from deeply separated human groups, as if Homo sapiens encountered lineages whose bones we have not yet found. The map of ancient Asia may have been crowded with human forms, some absorbed, some replaced, some erased before archaeology could catch them. The disappearance of ghost populations is almost impossible to describe because we do not know where the disappearance happened. There is no final valley, no last island, no cave with the final child of their kind. Their endings are hidden inside our beginnings. They may have died out as separate groups while leaving a few children with Homo sapiens. They may have been absorbed over generations until no distinct population remained. They may have been destroyed by climate, disease, competition, or simple isolation. But because their evidence survives only as fragments in genomes, their extinction feels less like a death scene and more like a silence written into blood. That is why the ghost populations belong at number one among the ancient human species that disappeared without answers. They are the ultimate reminder that human history is bigger than the fossil record. There were people whose bones we may never find, whose faces we may never reconstruct, and whose names no language preserved, yet they were real enough to enter us. Somewhere in prehistory, our ancestors met humans who are now known only by the traces they left behind in DNA. They lived, feared, adapted, perhaps loved, perhaps fought, and then vanished so completely that science had to discover them from the inside out. The most haunting lost humans are not the ones whose skulls stare at us from museum glass. They are the ones without faces, still hidden in the living.